Professor Scott, it's good seeing you again.
Good seeing you again, sir. Always a pleasure, Mr. Armstrong Williams.
Why do you think? Why do you think violence is escalating in school? Is it because of mental illness? Is it because of lack of parental environment in their child's lives? And also the impact it is having on the learning environment?
Absolutely. So again, thank you for having me again, Mr. Armstrong. I think a lot of it has to do with, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's some socio-emotional components that go into the maturation of a child. And what I see and what we have seen on the ground at the schools and even at the collegiate level, again, I'm here at Texas A&M San Antonio, is that if we do not invest, front load and invest into the child's social-emotional, psychosocial aspects, if we don't invest in those things, then you're going to see it manifested in bullying. And then you're going to see it manifested in suicide ideation or homicide ideation. And so I think what we need to do is we need to make a clear pathway for monies to be distributed back to the counselors, to get the counselors back into the classroom. Because right now, unfortunately, counselors are arbiters and purveyors of testing. Get them back in the classroom to do guidance curricula and less system support. We need to make sure that we can create these communicative vows between parents so that parents, see something, say something. We have Davis Law right here in Texas. It's no longer 300 feet from the school, but now it's cyberspace. If we see things online, we have a communicative vow between the school and the parent to say, hey, my student is being cyberbullied, or someone said they're going to bring a gun, and then that could be addressed immediately with the school resource officer,
let me interject.
and or the teachers.
Let me interject this.
Yes, sir.
We don't talk about, when you look at these schools, Professor, men, with probably the exception of athletics, there are statistics that bear out when there are men in schools, there's less violence. When there are men in their homes, there's less violence. When a man is in a child's life, there's less violence, and there's less mental illness. I mean, we keep talking about what becomes of the problem, but we never talk about what the problem really is. And it really goes back to a lot of these young men today just don't have the proper guidance and support and basic things, right from wrong, self-respect, discipline, work ethic. Professor.
Yes, sir. And so it's not the school's job necessarily to supplant what the parents and the community should be doing, right? But we are part of the community, common unity. And so one of the things I've done as an administrator is I was very intentional about inviting, your 100 black men. And again, I worked in urban schools, predominantly black and Hispanic schools. But we invited our 100 black men. We invited our churches, part of a church here. We invited members of our church to man the hallways, do bus duty. Have mentoring programs. I've also started some mentoring programs called Boys to Men, where we had some of our traditionally disengaged young men that, they weren't involved in band, choir, sports, or anything like that, but and they were involved in gangs, and they were involved in drug dealing. So we started Boys to Men, and those students, there's a saying, and I believe it was George Bush that said at an NAACP convention, no one rises to low expectations. Well, these young men were able to see archetypes of success of men who were giving them high expectations. And because they saw that, they wanted to be that. That's a little bit of Bandura's social learning theory. And when we saw that those traditionally disengaged, disempowered young men became leaders of the school. And they started wearing ties, and they started believing that they could be an equitable contributor to the progression of not just the school, but the community.
And at some point, and I think you and I will agree, many of these kids can be saved. But some are just not going to be saved. And
Yes, sir.
when you realize that they're not, it's not worth it to have them to continue the disruption in the school system and the community. At some point, there's got to be accountability and responsibility. They've just got to pay a price. You don't want that to happen, but there's got to be something to remove them from being disruptive in these environments.
Yes, sir. And that's the unfortunate thing. I know that there's been a lot of talk of what do we do with the students that have maladaptive behaviors? They're severely emotionally disturbed, and how do we disrupt the pipeline of prison? But again, if we either pay hard now or pay later, We front load now, or we're going to pay later. Those are going to be the kids that are going to shoot the school up. Those are going to be the kids that are going to, rob your stereo system in your car. And so my hope and my goal has always been, of course, we're going to focus on the top students and your middle of the road students, but let's come back and let's figure out a way to do a near peer. Have our students, I had some of my students doing mediation when I was a school counselor. Some of my students who are their peers do conflict mediation with these gang members and drug dealers. And when they started to see that their peers were actively involved in the progression of the school, they started to follow through. And I think that's what's happening now, is that we're not investing enough time, energy, dollars into prevention. I always focus prevention. We're focused on intervention. Once something has happened, once the kid has gone all the way, they're in 8th grade and their Lexile scores, their reading levels are low. We're now working on them. No, let's not remediate when they're in 8th grade. Let's remediate when they're 1st grade, 2nd grade, and we're starting to see signs of maladaptive behavior.
And how do we get young people to understand, to navigate conflict, sadness, when things don't go well? You don't always resort to violence. You don't resort to bullying. There are ways that you can express yourself to others, because in order for young kids to express themselves to you, they've got to build a trust with the adults that are in their lives.
Right. So one of the things, again, even as a former administrator and as a person that teaches prospective administrators, we have to disrupt the discipline, the disproportionality in discipline practices. So what do I mean by that? Black boys right now are 3-4 times more likely to be suspended, out of school suspension, for the same infraction of their white counterparts. Well, that's going to be problematic. All right. That's the research of SCIBA and many others. What we need to figure out is, okay, how are we going to invest more monies, more time, more resources in prevention, mentors, making sure that whatever those learning gaps are, making sure that we remediate those learning gaps. And here's another thing, and I know we're going to eventually talk about critical race theory, but then we got to make learning fun. All right, I've served 17 years in the K-12 system, and 6 years, I'm going for tenure now in the higher ed system. But we got to make learning fun. I've noticed that in all levels, if you're not speaking to the way a student learns, right, the multiple modalities in which a student learns, then they're going to check out. Listen, when we grew up, right, I don't know, we're probably around the same age perhaps, but when we grew up with commercials, Armstrong, right? But what we see now is people don't have commercials. Everything is right there, TikTok, Instagram, Netflix, everything is right there for them. Their brains are socialized to think, it used to be 7 minutes of programming, 2 minutes commercials, 7 minutes programming, 2 minutes commercials. Now it's none of that. Kids get what they want right then, and then you're asking a teacher to lecture for 45 to 90 minutes. It's not going to work. So we have to figure out a way to use multiple modalities to make sure that every learning style is tapped in, so every student has an optimal chance for an education.
It's always a pleasure having Professor Lawrence Scott from UT San Antonio join us. And because, the other thing that we need to focus on is that we have more things that we can agree on to work together to bring resolution to these communities than what we disagree with. And that's why I always appreciate Professor Scott joining us for these crises in the classroom. And men matter. Men in the classroom, men in their homes, men in the communities. We've got to get back to men taking care of their responsibility and accountability as well. Again, Professor Scott, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Armstrong, we're bridge builders. I'm glad to continue building these bridges with you, sir. God bless you.
Yes, sir. God bless you. Still to come, will Texas offer school choice? We'll take that and much more on Your Voice, Your Future, Crisis in the Classroom.